His hand was shaking, not from the cold. In Copper Ridge, Arizona, the heat could melt asphalt, but from something far worse. Grant Whitfield hadn't held anything this heavy in 55 years. A polished wooden box. Inside it, a silver star resting on blue velvet. His silver star. And standing in front of him, 70 Hell's Angels in full leather, boots locked together on the pavement, right hands raised in perfect military salute. 70 men. For him. The one-armed beggar who ate scraps from a dumpster behind the restaurant, where nobody even knew his name. But they knew. They knew what he did in that jungle. They knew about the 11 men, and what happened next turned an entire town inside out. The heat in Copper Ridge, Arizona, did not forgive. It pressed down on the cracked sidewalks of Main Street like a hand holding the whole town against a skillet, and by noon the air shimmered above the asphalt in long, lazy waves that made the buildings look like they were breathing. The thermometer outside Henning's Hardware read 107 degrees, but nobody needed a thermometer to know that. You could feel it in your teeth. Grant Whitfield sat on the concrete steps beside the dumpster behind the Golden Spur restaurant, his back against the warm brick wall, his one remaining hand resting on his knee. The right hand. The left sleeve of his flannel shirt was pinned neatly at the shoulder, folded and tucked, the way a man learns to do after 30 years of practice. He was 74 years old, and his body showed every single one of those years. The sun-darkened skin mapped with deep creases, the thin white hair that clung to his scalp like threads of old cotton, the pale blue eyes that had faded the way photographs fade when they sit too long in a window. He was waiting for the lunch rush to end. It was a Tuesday, which meant Diane Prescott would have the kitchen throw out whatever was left of the brisket special by 1:30. The brisket at the Golden Spur was not exceptional, but it was not bad either, and the portions were generous enough that whatever ended up in the black trash bags usually contained enough for a full meal if you were not particular about presentation. Grant had not been particular about presentation in a very long time. The back door swung open, and a young kitchen worker, no older than 19, with a grease-stained apron and headphones looped around his neck, stepped out, carrying 2 heavy bags. He saw Grant sitting there, and his face did that thing faces always did. That quick calculation, the brief tightening around the eyes, the look that said, "I see you, but I'm going to pretend I don't." "Afternoon," Grant said. His voice was dry and quiet, the kind of voice that comes from not using it enough. The kid dropped the bags into the dumpster without answering and went back inside. The door closed with a metallic click that echoed off the alley walls. Grant waited 2 full minutes. He had learned that patience was a form of dignity. And then he stood slowly, his knees protesting in that grinding way that never got better, only worse. He walked to the dumpster, lifted the lid with his right hand, and began to sort through the bags with practiced efficiency. A man with one arm learns shortcuts the rest of the world never thinks about. He braced the bag against the rim of the dumpster, tore it open with his fingers and teeth, and found what he was looking for: half a foil tray of sliced brisket, a pile of cornbread pieces, and a container of coleslaw that had gone slightly warm, but was otherwise untouched. He carried the food to his spot on the steps and ate slowly, carefully, the way a man eats when he knows there might not be another meal coming soon. From the alley, he could hear Main Street living its ordinary life. The bell above the door of the hardware store, a truck engine idling at the single traffic light, 2 women talking about someone's daughter's wedding. Copper Ridge was a town of 4,000 people, small enough that everyone knew everyone's name and business, and yet somehow Grant Whitfield had become invisible. He had lived in this town for 6 years before the bank took his house. He had shopped at the grocery store on 5th Avenue, had his truck serviced at Mackey's Auto, had sat in the 3rd pew at First Baptist Church every Sunday morning for half a decade. And now he sat behind a dumpster eating someone else's leftovers, and not a single person in Copper Ridge looked him in the eye. It was not cruelty exactly. It was something quieter than cruelty. It was the particular discomfort that respectable people feel when confronted with evidence that respectability is not permanent. Grant Whitfield was a reminder that the distance between a house and a sidewalk is shorter than anyone wants to believe, and reminders like that make people look away. He finished the brisket and wiped his hand on his jeans. The coleslaw was too warm, so he left it. He folded the foil tray and placed it neatly inside the torn bag. Even now, even here, he kept things orderly. It was a habit drilled into him 50 years ago in a place 10,000 miles from this alley, and habits like that outlast everything else. The front door of the Golden Spur faced Main Street, and through the alley Grant could see the tables on the sidewalk patio where the lunch crowd lingered over iced tea and pie. He recognized most of them. Roger Stanton in his pale blue polo shirt, talking too loud on his phone. Barbara from the post office, a couple of retirees from the golf course development north of town. None of them had ever done him harm. None of them had ever done him any good either. He settled back against the wall and closed his eyes. The shade would last another hour, maybe two. After that, he would walk to the park on Prescott Avenue, where the old cottonwood trees threw enough shadow to make the afternoon bearable. Then the library until closing. Then the overhang behind the laundromat on 6th Street, where he slept most nights on a piece of cardboard he kept hidden behind the ventilation unit. This was his life. It was not much of one, but it was the only one he had left. He was almost asleep when he heard it, faint at first, like distant thunder rolling across the desert floor, but growing steadily, building into something that vibrated in his chest before it reached his ears. The low, heavy, unmistakable rumble of motorcycle engines, not one or two, not even 10. The sound kept growing, deepening, layering on itself until the air itself seemed to throb with it, and Grant opened his eyes and sat up straight, because in 74 years of living he had never heard anything quite like this. The rumble became a roar, and the roar filled Main Street from one end to the other, and through the narrow alley Grant Whitfield watched as the first motorcycles appeared. A wall of chrome and black leather rolling slowly, deliberately, like a parade that nobody had organized and nobody had expected. The motorcycles came in a formation so tight and disciplined that it looked rehearsed. They rolled down Main Street two abreast, engines growling at low throttle, the riders sitting upright with the kind of posture that said this was not a casual ride. Each bike was a heavyweight cruiser. Harleys, mostly, with a few Indians mixed in. And each rider wore the same uniform, black leather vest over dark clothing, heavy boots, and the unmistakable patch on the back, the winged death's head, the words that made small towns nervous. Hell's Angels. 70 of them. Copper Ridge had never seen anything like it. The traffic light at the intersection of Main and 4th turned red, then green, then red again, and nobody moved because there was nowhere to move. The motorcycles filled the street from curb to curb, and when the last bike passed the intersection, the lead riders were already parking in a long, precise row in front of the Golden Spur and the shops on either side. Inside the restaurant, Diane Prescott stood at the front window with her hand pressed flat against the glass, her face drained of color. She had owned the Golden Spur for 12 years and had dealt with her share of difficult customers, drunks, loudmouths, people who complained about the brisket and then ate every bite. But this was different. This was 70 men in leather vests with a reputation that preceded them like a shockwave. "Call Walter," she said to her waitress, Maria, without turning from the window. "Call the sheriff right now." On the patio, Roger Stanton had ended his phone call and was standing with his napkin still tucked into his collar, staring at the line of motorcycles with an expression that mixed indignation with genuine fear. "This is exactly what I've been talking about," he said to no one in particular. "This is exactly what happens when you don't maintain standards." The riders dismounted with the kind of unhurried confidence that comes from knowing that nobody is going to rush you. They removed their helmets, stretched their backs, spoke to each other in low voices. Some were young, late 20s, early 30s, with thick beards and tattoo sleeves that ran from wrist to shoulder. Others were older, weathered men with grey in their hair and reading glasses tucked into their vest pockets. They were white, black, and everything in between. They were large and small, lean and heavy. The only thing uniform about them besides the vests was the way they carried themselves, with a quiet, deliberate authority that did not need to raise its voice. At the head of the column, Seth Caldwell swung his leg over his bike and planted both boots on the asphalt. He was 52 years old, built like a man who had done physical labor his entire life, with a chest like a barrel and hands that could palm a basketball. His beard was dark with threads of silver running through it, and his arms were covered in tattoos, an eagle on the right forearm, a set of military service dates on the left, and across both knuckles the faded letters of words that had been there so long they were part of his skin. He wore aviator sunglasses that caught the Arizona sun and turned it into two small fires. He looked at the Golden Spur. He looked at the patio, where Roger Stanton and the other customers sat frozen. And then he turned and looked down the alley beside the restaurant, and something in his expression changed. A softening around the jaw, a slight drop of the shoulders, as if he had been carrying something heavy and had finally found the place to set it down. "Tommy," he said. Tommy Brewer appeared at his side instantly, 34, tall and lean, with a shaved head and a scar on his chin that he had earned in a bar fight in Flagstaff 8 years ago. He was Seth's vice president, and the kind of man who could read his president's mood from a single word. "He's here," Seth said quietly, "just like Pete told us." Tommy looked down the alley and saw the old man sitting on the steps by the dumpster, thin, white-haired, one-armed, watching them with an expression that was more curious than afraid. Tommy had seen the photograph that Pete Dawson had shown them at the clubhouse 3 weeks ago. The man in the photograph had been young, standing in jungle terrain with a rifle and a grin and 2 strong arms. But the eyes were the same. You could not mistake those eyes. "That's him," Tommy said. By now, Sheriff Walter Hennings had arrived. He came on foot from the station 2 blocks away, walking with the measured pace of a man who does not want to appear either rushed or relaxed. He was 61, built thick through the middle, with a mustache that covered his entire upper lip and a hat that he wore tilted slightly back on his head. He had been sheriff of Copper Ridge for 14 years and had dealt with his share of trouble, but 70 Hells Angels on Main Street was a new chapter in his career. "Afternoon," he said, approaching Seth with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "That's a lot of motorcycles for a Tuesday." Seth removed his sunglasses and looked at the sheriff with eyes that were brown and steady and entirely calm. "Afternoon, Sheriff. We're not here for trouble. Nobody ever says they're here for trouble." "Fair point." Seth folded his sunglasses and tucked them into his vest pocket. "We're here for one reason, and it's that man right there." He pointed down the alley toward Grant. "We're going to need about 2 hours, and I give you my word, my personal word, that when we leave, this street will be cleaner than when we found it." Walter looked down the alley. He looked at the 70 men standing beside their motorcycles, some of them now lighting cigarettes, others stretching, all of them behaving with a quiet order that he had frankly not expected. He looked back at Seth. 2 hours, Walter said. 2 hours. I'll be watching. I'd expect nothing less. Walter stepped back and took a position on the sidewalk across the street, where he could see everything without being in the way. He was a practical man. 70 Hells Angels were going to do whatever 70 Hells Angels had decided to do, and unless they broke a law, his job was to observe, not to obstruct. But his hands stayed close to his radio, and his eyes did not rest. Inside the Golden Spur, Diane watched through the window as Seth Caldwell walked down the alley toward the old man who ate from her dumpster every day. She felt something twist in her stomach. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. Grant watched the big man in the leather vest walk toward him, and he did not stand up. It was not defiance. It was simply that his knees hurt, and he had learned a long time ago that standing up to impress people was a waste of energy. If this man meant him harm, standing would not prevent it. If he meant something else, standing was not required. Seth stopped 3 feet away and looked down at Grant for a long moment. The alley was quiet except for the ticking of cooling motorcycle engines on the street and the faint hum of the restaurant's ventilation system. "Grant Whitfield," Seth said. It was not a question. Grant tilted his head. "Do I know you?" "No, sir, but I know you, or rather, I know what you did." Seth crouched down so that he was eye level with the older man, and the leather of his vest creaked as he settled onto his heels. "My name is Seth Caldwell. I'm the president of the Desert Sons chapter, and the man who told me about you is someone you haven't seen in a very long time." From behind Seth, another man appeared in the alley. Older, with long white hair, pulled back in a ponytail and round glasses that sat on a sun-weathered nose. He walked slowly, with the slight limp that comes from a hip that has been broken and healed imperfectly. And when he stepped into the shade of the alley and Grant saw his face, something happened to the old man's expression. The careful blankness he had worn like armor for years cracked, and underneath it was something raw and startled and young. "Pete?" Grant whispered. Pete Dawson smiled. It was a gentle smile, full of decades. "Hey, Whitfield, you look terrible." Grant stared at him, his mouth opened and closed. His right hand gripped his own knee, the knuckles turning white. "Pete Dawson, I thought you were dead." "Almost a few times, but not quite." Pete lowered himself onto the step beside Grant, groaning softly, and for a moment the two old men just sat there, shoulder to shoulder, the way they had sat in a foxhole in the Quang Tri province in 1971 when they were 19 years old, and the world was made of mud and noise and fear. Seth stood up and stepped back, giving them space. He caught Tommy's eye and nodded once, and Tommy turned to the street and raised both hands above his head. It was a signal. The 70 riders began to move. What happened next would be talked about in Copper Ridge for years. The men fanned out across Main Street with a purpose and coordination that looked almost military. A group of 12 began unloading supplies from the saddlebags and trailers hitched to several of the bikes. Folding tables, tablecloths, trays of food covered in aluminum foil, coolers filled with drinks, stacks of paper plates and cups. Another group set up a canopy tent in front of the Golden Spur, stretching the fabric tight against the metal frame with practiced hands. Others began arranging chairs in rows facing a small area at the center, creating something that looked like a stage without actually being one. On the sidewalk, Roger Stanton watched with his mouth slightly open. "What the hell is this?" he said. Sheriff Hennings, standing across the street with his arms folded, said nothing. But he had uncrossed his arms, and his hand was no longer near his radio. In the alley, Pete was talking, and Grant was listening with the stillness of a man hearing his own history spoken aloud for the first time in decades. "I tracked you down 6 months ago," Pete said. "Took me a while. You're not easy to find when you don't want to be found. I called the VA in Phoenix, and they told me you'd dropped out of the system. No address, no phone, no benefits. I called your old number in Flagstaff, and it was disconnected. I even called that church you used to go to, and the pastor said you just disappeared." "I didn't disappear," Grant said quietly. "I just ran out of places to be." Pete nodded. He understood. After Vietnam, after the injuries, after the decades of silence that the country had wrapped around its veterans like a bandage over a wound it did not want to look at, he understood how a man could simply run out of places. "I found you through a shelter worker in Tucson," Pete continued. "She remembered you. Said you'd stayed there for a few weeks last winter but left because you said you didn't want to take a bed from someone who needed it more. That sounded like you. That sounded exactly like you." Grant said nothing. He was looking at the street, where the men in leather vests were transforming Main Street into something unrecognizable. Tables were set. Food was being uncovered: barbecue chicken, ribs, potato salad, corn on the cob, baked beans, cornbread, pies. Enough food for 100 people, maybe more. "I told Seth your story," Pete said. "I told him everything. About Quang Tri, about what you did for our platoon, about the arm." He paused. "I told him about the Silver Star." Grant's jaw tightened. "That was a long time ago, Pete." "It was. But what you did doesn't expire. It doesn't have a statute of limitations." Pete put his hand on Grant's shoulder, the right shoulder, the one that still had an arm attached to it. "You saved 11 men that day, Grant. 11 men who went home to their families because you did what you did. And one of those men was me." The silence between them was heavy with 55 years of unsaid things. The desert heat pressed down. A fly buzzed near the dumpster. From the street came the sound of men laughing and working, the clatter of folding tables being locked into position, the pop and hiss of coolers being opened. "I didn't do it for a medal," Grant said. "I know you didn't. That's exactly the point." Diane Prescott had come to the front door of the Golden Spur and was watching the transformation of her street with an expression she could not have named if someone had asked her. The men who had terrified her 15 minutes ago were setting tables with more care than her own staff used on a Saturday night. One of them, a massive man with a red beard and arms like tree trunks, was arranging wildflowers in mason jars at the center of each table. Another was hanging a hand-painted banner between 2 light poles. The banner read, "Honoring SGT Grant Whitfield, Silver Star recipient, American hero." Diane read the banner twice. She looked down the alley at the old man sitting on her steps, the man she had never spoken to, the man she had allowed her kitchen staff to ignore, the man whose name she had never even known, though he had been sitting beside her dumpster almost every day for 2 years. Her eyes began to sting, and she pressed her fingers against them hard. Seth walked back to the alley and extended his hand to Grant. "Sir, would you come with me?" Grant looked at the hand. It was a large hand, scarred and calloused, with tattoo ink running across the knuckles. It was the kind of hand that most people in Copper Ridge would cross the street to avoid. Grant took it, and Seth pulled him to his feet with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his appearance. They walked together out of the alley and onto Main Street, and when Grant stepped into the sunlight and saw what was waiting for him, he stopped. His legs simply stopped moving, and he stood there on the sidewalk with his one hand hanging at his side and his mouth pressed into a tight line, and he did not speak because there were no words in any language he knew for what he was seeing. 70 men stood in 2 long rows on either side of Main Street, forming a corridor that led to the canopy tent and the tables and the banner with his name on it. They stood at attention, not the sloppy, approximated attention of civilians, but the real thing, the kind that is learned through repetition and muscle memory, and the understanding that some moments demand your very best posture. Many of these men were veterans themselves. Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force. They had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Kuwait, Panama. Some had served in peacetime. All of them understood what a Silver Star meant, and all of them understood what it meant to find the man who had earned 1 eating scraps from a dumpster in a town that had forgotten he existed. Seth walked Grant down that corridor, and as they passed, each man raised his right hand to his brow in a crisp, sharp salute. One by one, down the line, the salutes rose and held, a wave of respect rolling from one end of Main Street to the other. The sound of leather creaking and boots shifting on asphalt was the only noise. Even the wind had stopped. Grant walked with his back straight. He did not cry. He had trained himself a long time ago to keep that particular door closed, and it stayed closed now, though the pressure behind it was enormous. He nodded to each man as he passed, the way a sergeant acknowledges his soldiers, and his nod was steady even though his legs were not. At the end of the corridor, under the canopy, a chair had been placed at the head of the longest table. Seth guided Grant to it and pulled it out for him. And Grant sat down, and the 70 men broke formation and gathered around the tables, and the street that had been tense with fear 20 minutes ago was suddenly alive with something else entirely. They served him first. A plate loaded with barbecue and all the sides, a tall glass of sweet tea with ice, a cloth napkin that someone had actually ironed. Tommy Brewer set the plate in front of Grant and said, "Sergeant Whitfield, it is an honor." Then Tommy stepped back and waited until Grant had taken his first bite before anyone else sat down. The meal unfolded slowly, the way good meals do when they carry more weight than just food. The men ate and talked, and their conversations were loud and profane and full of laughter, and the sound of it filled Main Street like music. Pete sat beside Grant and talked about the years between then and now, his own struggles, his own dark stretches, the motorcycle club that had given him a brotherhood when the world had taken his first one away. "These men saved my life," Pete told Grant. "Not the way you saved it in Quang Tri, different, slower, but just as real. When I got back from Vietnam, I was drowning. You know how it was. Nobody wanted to hear about it. Nobody wanted to look at us. I spent 15 years trying to drink myself into the ground, and when I finally came up for air, these were the men who pulled me out." Seth, sitting across the table, heard this and added, "Half the men at these tables have a story like that. We're not what people think we are. We never have been." Roger Stanton was still on the patio of the Golden Spur, but he had stopped talking. He was watching the scene on the street with an expression that had migrated from indignation through confusion and had now arrived at something quieter. He was watching a one-armed old man eat a meal surrounded by 70 men who treated him like royalty, and he was beginning to understand that he had been wrong about several things at once. Sheriff Hennings crossed the street and approached the gathering. Seth stood to meet him, and the two men looked at each other for a moment. "I misjudged this situation," Walter said. "Most people do," Seth replied. There was no bitterness in it, just a fact. Walter looked at Grant, who was listening to Pete tell a story about a fishing trip that had gone sideways somewhere in Montana. "Is it true," Walter asked, "about the Silver Star?" Seth reached into his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a printout from the National Archives, an official citation. He handed it to the sheriff. Walter unfolded it and read it slowly, his lips moving slightly. The citation described an action on March 14, 1971, near Firebase Fuller in Quang Tri Province, Republic of Vietnam. It described how Sergeant Grant Whitfield, after his unit was ambushed and pinned down by enemy fire, had crossed 60 meters of open ground under sustained automatic weapons fire to reach a disabled personnel carrier where 11 wounded soldiers were trapped. It described how he had pulled those soldiers out one by one, making 11 trips across that same 60 meters while bullets struck the ground around him. It described how, on the 11th trip, a round had struck his left arm, shattering the bone beyond repair. It described how he had continued to pull the last man to safety with one functioning arm before collapsing from blood loss. Walter folded the paper and handed it back. He took off his hat and held it against his chest. "Sergeant Whitfield," he said, and his voice was rough, "I owe you an apology. This whole town does." Grant looked up from his plate. "You don't owe me anything, Sheriff." "Nobody does. I just got old and unlucky. It happens." "Maybe, but we could have been better." Diane Prescott came out of the restaurant carrying a tray. On it were 10 slices of her best pecan pie, the recipe she usually saved for Thanksgiving. She walked to Grant's table and set the tray down, and then she stood there, and her eyes were red. And she said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know." Grant looked at her. "You knew I was hungry," he said. "Not unkindly, just truthfully. You didn't need to know anything else." The words landed in the silence like stones dropping into still water, and the ripples spread outward, and Diane pressed her hand over her mouth and nodded because he was right. She had known he was hungry. That should have been enough. That should have been everything. The afternoon shadows grew long on Main Street, and the tables were still full, and the conversations had deepened the way conversations do when strangers become something more than strangers. The initial spectacle had drawn people from all over Copper Ridge, shop owners who had locked their doors to come and see, retirees who had walked from the park, teenagers who had heard the motorcycles and followed the sound. The street that had been shut down by fear was now shut down by community, and nobody seemed to mind. Seth Caldwell stood and walked to the center of the canopy, and the conversations faded to silence as 70 men and a growing crowd of townspeople turned to listen. "Most of you don't know me," Seth said. His voice carried easily. It was a voice built for open spaces. "And most of you made up your minds about me the moment you saw my vest. That's fine. I'm used to it. We're all used to it." He looked around at his brothers, and a few of them nodded. "You see the leather, the patches, the tattoos, and you write a story in your head. Criminals, thugs, dangerous men. And maybe some of that story has been true at some point for some people. I'm not here to pretend we're saints." He paused and looked at Grant. "But I am here to ask you a question. That man right there, Sergeant Grant Whitfield, has been sitting behind your dumpsters and sleeping under your overhangs for 3 years. 3 years. In a town of 4,000 people. How does a man become invisible in a town of 4,000 people?" The silence was absolute. Roger Stanton looked at his shoes. Diane pressed her hands together in her lap. Sheriff Henning stood with his hat still against his chest. "I'll tell you how," Seth continued. "The same way you made us invisible the moment we rode in. You looked at the outside and decided you knew the inside. You saw a one-armed old man in dirty clothes, and you decided he was nothing. You saw us, and you decided we were trouble. And in both cases, you were wrong, because that man is a genuine hero. He saved 11 lives. He left his arm in a jungle on the other side of the world so that 11 families could have their sons come home. And not one of you, not one, ever asked him his name." Pete Dawson stood up beside Grant and put his hand on the old man's shoulder. "I'm one of those 11, Pete said. His voice was not as strong as Seth's. It was older, thinner, slightly shaky, but it carried the weight of direct testimony. "March 14th, 1971. I was 20 years old, and I was trapped in a burning carrier with a piece of shrapnel in my hip, and this man right here ran through gunfire to pull me out. He didn't ask my name first. He didn't ask if I deserved it. He just came." A woman in the crowd, someone Grant did not recognize, was crying openly. Several of the bikers had removed their sunglasses and were wiping their eyes with the backs of their hands, trying to do it subtly and failing. Grant sat very still. The door he had kept closed for so long was straining against its hinges now, and he could feel the pressure building behind his eyes and in his throat, and he gripped the edge of the table with his one hand and held on. Seth reached into a leather saddlebag that Tommy had brought from his bike and pulled out a wooden box, polished and dark. He opened it, and inside, resting on a bed of blue velvet, was a medal, a silver star, newly minted, with a fresh ribbon. Beside it was a framed photograph, a young Grant Whitfield in uniform, standing in front of Firebase Fuller, grinning at the camera with both arms intact and the whole future ahead of him. "We had your medal replaced," Seth said. Pete told us you lost it somewhere along the way, and we want you to have this photograph. It's from Pete's personal collection. It's the only copy." Seth placed the box on the table in front of Grant, and then he did something that nobody expected. He snapped to attention and saluted, a perfect textbook military salute from one veteran to another. And behind him 70 men stood and did the same, and the sound of their boots hitting the pavement in unison was like a single heartbeat from a single enormous body. Grant looked at the medal. He looked at the photograph of the young man he had been. He looked at the 70 men standing at attention in the middle of a street, in a small Arizona town that had forgotten he existed, and the door finally broke. He cried, not loudly, not dramatically. Grant Whitfield was not built for drama. He cried the way old soldiers cry, with his shoulders shaking and his jaw clenched and his one hand covering his eyes, and the sound of it was so quiet that only Pete, sitting right beside him, could hear it. But everyone could see it, and everyone felt it, and the street was silent except for the distant sound of the desert wind moving through the cottonwood trees at the edge of town. When he finally lowered his hand, his eyes were red, but his voice was steady. "I've been called a lot of things," he said. "Bum, beggar, nuisance, eyesore. I've been told to move along by police officers and business owners and people I used to sit next to in church. And today, the people everybody warned me to stay away from, the people this whole town was afraid of, are the ones who showed up." He looked at Seth. "You want to talk about not judging by appearances? This is it. This is the whole lesson right here." Seth smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible behind the beard, but it was real. "We've been on the other side of that lesson our whole lives, Sergeant. Figured it was time somebody told the story from the right angle." The evening came slowly to Copper Ridge, the way it does in the desert. The sky turning from blue to gold to deep orange, the heat finally loosening its grip, the air cooling enough to breathe deeply without effort. The tables were cleared, the canopy was folded, the trash was collected and bagged and placed neatly beside the dumpster that Grant would never need to search through again. Because before they left, the men of the Desert Sons chapter did one more thing. Nancy Caldwell, Seth's wife, had driven down from their home in Prescott in a pickup truck loaded with supplies. She was a nurse, practical and efficient, and she had brought clothes, shoes, toiletries, and a folder full of paperwork. VA benefit applications, housing assistance forms, medical referrals. She sat with Grant at the table while the street was being cleaned and walked him through every form, filling in the blanks with a pen she kept behind her ear. "You're eligible for a disability pension, a housing voucher, and full medical coverage," she said, her voice carrying the firm gentleness of a woman who spent her days taking care of people who had forgotten how to take care of themselves. "You should have been receiving these benefits for decades. We're going to fix that." Seth had made phone calls. A member of the club named Danny Ashford owned a small rental property in Prescott, a one-bedroom cottage with a porch and a view of the mountains, and he had offered it to Grant rent-free for as long as he needed. "It's nothing fancy," Danny said when Grant tried to protest, "but it's got a roof and a door that locks, and that's more than a dumpster." The motorcycles started again at sundown. The engines filled Main Street one last time, and the town stood on the sidewalks and watched as the 70 riders formed their column and prepared to leave. But before they did, Seth walked back to Grant, who was standing, really standing, with his shoulders back and his chin up, on the sidewalk in front of the Golden Spur. "You need anything," Seth said. "You call, day or night. You're not invisible anymore, Sergeant. Not to us. Not ever." Grant nodded. He extended his right hand, and Seth took it, and they held the handshake for a long time, long enough for it to say everything that words could not. The motorcycles pulled away, and the rumble faded down the highway, and the silence that followed was different from the silence that had come before. It was not the silence of a man being ignored. It was the silence of a town waking up. In the weeks that followed, Copper Ridge changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but in the small, steady ways that real change happens. Diane Prescott started a free meal program at the Golden Spur for anyone who needed one. No questions asked. Roger Stanton, who had spent years complaining about standards and the wrong element, quietly wrote a check to the Veterans Assistance Fund in Prescott and never mentioned it to anyone. Sheriff Hennings began checking in on the town's homeless residents by name, learning their stories, connecting them with services, and Grant Whitfield moved into the cottage in Prescott with a porch and a view of the mountains. He received his disability pension. He saw a doctor. He slept in a bed. He ate meals at a table. And every third Saturday, a column of motorcycles would pull up to his cottage, and 70 men would take him to lunch, and they would sit together and eat and laugh, and nobody looked away. The distance between a house and a sidewalk is shorter than anyone wants to believe, but the distance between indifference and compassion is shorter still. Sometimes all it takes is 70 motorcycles, and the courage to look past the leather, past the dirt, past every assumption you have ever made about who deserves your respect and who does not. Sometimes the people you feared the most are the ones who teach you how to see.